In this episode of the Model Guy, I'll be taking on Tamiya's P-38H Lightning using some Quintess Studios decals and some Model Master barrels, all supplied by the fantastic Mark from HobbyNut Models. You can check out the HobbyNut Model store below by clicking on the link and enjoying that 10% off discount. Make sure you tell them that Robbie sent you. In 2019, Tamiya dropped the P-38 kit, and even now, 2 years later, it's still, in my opinion, the best 148 aircraft kit on the market. The kit comes with great detail in the box, the engineering is out of this world, and it's a really fun build. There's no roadblocks you run into, and you get to put all of your energy into being creative with the kit. Up into 2019, the most accurate P-38 kit on the market was one released by Academy, and unless you're a fan of twisted tails, pretty nasty fit and a lot of cleanup, it left a lot to be desired. That could be understandable because the P-38 has a very unique design to it, and to engineer a kit that would go together well is probably a challenge that really Tamiya is the only developer that could do. You have your pods, your booms, and you need everything to be square, so there's a lot of challenges to overtake. The only real downfall to Tamiya's P-38, and it's really my own personal opinion, is that you only get the F, G, or H models, and they're all in olive drab. Sure, you can do one or two in Recon Blue, but let's face it, a P-38 looks even sexier when it's wearing a natural metal finish. But I'll wait, because I would put money on Tamiya releasing the J variant down the road. The P-38 Lightning entered service with the US Army Air Corps shortly before World War II, and at the time was the most advanced aircraft coming off American production lines. It was also the first military aircraft to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight. Not only was the P-38 Lightning fast, it could also fly and dogfight at high altitude and had pretty long legs and could escort bombers quite a ways. With all these traits wrapped up into one aircraft, it was the main fighter of the American Army until the arrival of the P-51D Mustang in the Pacific Theater. Lockheed was so confident in the performance of the Lightning that they sunk over $750,000 into development of the prototype after they told the American Air Corps that they'd only need $160,000. The Lightning also had an auspicious start after the prototype crashed from icing heading into New York on a speed run to set some world records. Another major and dangerous challenge to pilots new to the airframe was the fact that both engines initially rotated in the same direction, giving them a lot of torque to deal with on takeoff and at full power settings. This problem was eventually solved by having one of the engines rotate in the opposite direction, therefore canceling all torque the aircraft experienced, and a great side effect of that was they now had a very stable gun platform. Where most World War II fighters carried their guns in the wings and had to be angled inwards to cross trajectories, that gave them a very limited range of fire. Because the P-38 didn't have to worry about that convergence of the guns, it could fire a lot further distances than other fighters. One serious flaw that P-38 pilots had to deal with for almost the entire war was the fact that if they ever went into a dive with their P-38, it might not come out. Due to the high speed of the aircraft and the buildup of air pressure around the elevator, the pilots lost control of the aircraft and couldn't do anything. They were generally left with three options. Option 1, hope that when the aircraft got to lower altitude and more dense air, they could get control back. The second option was to use the trim tabs to try to trim their way out of the dive, which took a lot of altitude to do. Or option 3, if they could, open the canopy and bail out. It wasn't until 1943, 2 years after the Lightning was in service, that engineers had finally designed and developed dive flaps to install in the P-38. Now, these are not the same style dive flaps as you'd see in a dive bomber meant to slow the aircraft down in a dive. It was meant to change that area of pressure buildup. And to add insult to injury, the dive flaps weren't incorporated to the assembly line until almost 14 months later, so most ground crews had to install the flaps in the field or outside the production line on the aprons. Even with the dive problem of the P-38, experienced pilots were able to use it as a very effective aircraft, and some of the top aces in the Pacific Theater were flying the Lightning. Richard Bong for one, maybe you heard of him. Another famous US pilot who cut his teeth flying the Lightning early in his career was Robin Olds, a pilot who later distinguished himself flying the F-4 as well in Vietnam and going on to be General of the Air Force. Perhaps the most famous mission that a P-38 Lightning took part in was Operation Vengeance, where US planners intercepted Japanese communications again because the lesson hadn't been learned at Midway, and to set up a mission where P-38s would intercept Yamamoto's bomber he was flying on and shoot it down. Even though the Lightning had very long legs and would be able to complete the mission, it was going to be very time restricted and it was going to involve some very precise navigation. The leader of the mission, Major Mitchell, asked that the P-38's compass be swapped out for a Navy-style compass, which he felt was more accurate. This was going to be critical because the first 600 miles of the flight were going to be over water at 50 feet and would have no landmarks to reference. Timing for the flight was also going to be critical because they would only have 10 minutes worth of fuel to search for Yamamoto before they'd have to turn for home. Another thing that the squadron did prior to the mission was swap out one of their drop tanks from the usual 600-liter tank to a 1,200-liter tank. And yes, Tamiya does include both tanks in the kit. With all the planning behind the mission and a little bit of luck, the Americans were able to shoot down both Betty bombers that were carrying Yamamoto and his staff and return to base. Even with the success of the mission, the Americans couldn't release a statement that they'd killed Yamamoto because that would give away how they found out he was traveling. Even with the cover story that they'd been tracking some high-ranking officers, they didn't want to risk that the Japanese would find out that they were able to break their codes. It wasn't until 6 months later that Times Magazine ran an article about Operation Vengeance, citing the name of the op and naming several of the pilots. The US Navy was very upset because this was a huge breach of security. Even decades later, in 2006, an article came out in the US Air Force magazine, still not entirely sure who shot down Yamamoto's aircraft, as two pilots were both claiming they had done so at the time. Leading up to the D-Day invasion of Normandy, P-38s accounted for almost 90% of the aerial reconnaissance photos taken of the battle space. It was also filling the role of night fighter, pathfinder, and taking BDA photos of targets after they were bombed. It also proved, by carrying rockets and bombs, it could be a very capable ground attack aircraft as well, the only drawback being its liquid-cooled engines. The Lightning was quickly phased out in Europe by the P-51 Mustang, however there were 10,000 Lightnings built during the course of the war. And on a gaming note, I was a huge fan of the game 1941 in the 80s on Nintendo, and that also featured the P-38 Lightning. The only thing I can fault this kit for, and is pretty much common with all of Tamiya's kits, is the decals are too thick. I'm not sure if that's something they do just to make them easier to handle for modelers, but when it comes to cleaning them up, there's a lot more work involved. And it's actually less work, I find, to paint on the markings. The kit includes the decals for 162 Skidoo and the aircraft that shot down Yamamoto, but I just found them too flashy and wasn't really a fan of the yellow on green. So I did a little more research and found a Lightning that had the red trim on it and just went with a generic number of 204. Also, being an aircraft that was going to be based in the Pacific Theater of Operations, I made sure to do a silver undercoat to prep for chipping and then fired on 2 layers of chipping fluid. I lightly put down the layers of chipping fluid because if it starts to bead up, you've put too much on and your paint's going to tear off and not going to chip properly. Once that had all dried, I came in to start black basing or color basing the base paint colors of the aircraft. And to get that gray, I started with a AK Real Colors Gunship gray, then I went with German gray from Tamiya, and then finally AK Real Colors Neutral gray. The whole point of doing black basing is just to break up the color. Instead of just having a solid green on top of the aircraft or solid gray underneath, it gives you a lot more tone and a lot more depth to the paint. That's also an effect you can do with oils or post shading, but I just find this way here gives me a lot more control when I start laying down the filter layer of how much of that tone and variance is going to show. Even though it looks very extreme right now, by the time you come in with your pin wash and your decals and start adding in your last little bit of details, it'll start to break that up and push it back quite a bit. So what looks drastic now at this point in the build, by the end of it may not entirely be noticeable. At this point I figured out that painting the markings before laying down the main paint or on top of the chipping layer gives it a lot more durability, and I don't have to worry about the markings getting destroyed or coming off like they did on the Spitfire build. The nice thing about painting your markings is you don't have to worry about getting things to sink down into rivets or panel lines. The paint just goes right in there and it gives you a lot more freedom to play with the colors. Just like how Edward's blue for the stars didn't look quite right for the Spitfire, you're able to adjust it by painting them on yourself. One of the great things about this Tamiya kit is it goes together so well that it leaves you a lot of energy left over for being creative with other things in the kit. Chipping, weathering, whatever you like to do. You're not fighting the fit or correcting things to get them to go together properly, which starts to sap your mojo. This kit itself, there's nothing wrong with it. You follow the instructions and everything goes together. I didn't use any filler, no putty, and really it went together with no surprises. And I would recommend it for any builder. If you're a brand new builder to the hobby, or you're a veteran that's been building, I don't know, monogram kits since the 60s, 70s, this kit, it's there for everybody. There's nothing that challenging about it. That's also not saying it's a simple kit either, because there's tons of detail and it just looks beautiful when it's done. And I just want to take this minute to really thank Mark for providing this for me to build, because it's been on my list, but it's one I've been having trouble finding in Canada, and he really helped me out by sending this, and I hope he's enjoying the build. I've been asked a few times about these stencils I used for the mottling and splattering, and they're splatter templates from Yushi. It's something you don't necessarily need, but if you're someone that likes doing black basting or post shading, it speeds the process up quite a bit and lets you be more random than you'd be trying to use just an airbrush and a needle. For this build, Tamiya also provides a 1:1 scale drawing in color for your demarcation line for camouflage, and I simply made a photocopy of those onto A4 paper, cut them out with a hobby knife, and taped them on with two-sided tape to get a feathered effect at the edge. There was a little bit of touching up I did with my other airbrush, my PS270, but for the most part it came across very well. There was also a little bit of a pucker factor here because I didn't do any testing for this style masking. Other than doing a little bit of on the Frank, it was going to be a challenge because I'm trying to do even squared stripes on a tail that's narrowing at the back. So it took a few attempts to tape it, but I was pretty confident before I painted it. It's just one of my favorite parts of modeling is when you start to pull masks off and you notice that something worked. Now, while I'm doing the unmasking here and carrying on with some basic assembly, what is a kit that you would like to see Tamiya develop? If you could have your say and they'd produce it, what would be a kit that you'd like to see? Write it in the comments section below and let us know. One dangerous game that I decided to play with this build, and one that I'd not tried before on a test mule, is to try different colors for black basing that are not the same color as the final tone. And for that olive drab, I wanted to throw in some Zinc Chromate yellow to let that show through a little bit. I also used some Nato black, Nato green, and I ended up using what's called dark tan from the Southeast Asia kit from AK Real Colors. And even though those colors are drastically different from the green, they make it look quite interesting once you start putting your filter on. And you'll see as this comes together that lets that green olive drab show some brown as well. By pre-shading and post-shading with the different colors, it really makes that green paint pop. It also serves as a great test bed for when the B-17 comes back onto the bench. That's on hold right now just because I've done the P-47 and the Lightning, and having done two aircraft in OD over neutral gray, I was kind of looking for something a little bit different for the next build just to change things up. And if you're a member of my Patreon page, you already know what that next build is, and you're actually going to see the first build on this channel that goes more in depth and turns into a series. Instead of doing one video in about 20-25 minutes that cuts out quite a lot of what I'm doing, I thought it'd be fun just to change it up for a build or two to do a series that lets you see what I'm doing, and also, more importantly, why I'm doing the things I am, just because I thought that would help some other builders out, and it would be great just to show what my process is. I'm not saying that my process is the best one or even makes sense or I should be doing the things I am. I just want to show what I do and why I do it. Now that that last layer of olive drab's gone on, you can really see how much is going on with that paint, and this has been my favorite paint job to date. The only thing I wish I'd done differently was have it broken up quite a lot more, because later on in the build, the pin wash and the last little bit of oils really blended it quite a bit more than I was hoping and kind of took away from it. One of the greatest things about this Tamiya kit is the fact that you can paint the booms before installing them. And the reason that's important is anytime you're painting in a tight area like a wing root or where an engine joins the wing, it's a really tight area that increases the chances for dusting paint and having a really rough finish. Usually I get in there really tight and do a really wet coat, but because the boom was separate, it just made painting so much easier. This kit kind of turned me into a little bit of a model snob because it was so easy to build. What is the significance of the number 204? Nothing. It's just a number that I kind of threw onto the silhouette template just to see what looked nice, and I just liked how it took up a little bit more area than 116 that was on the reference I was using. For chipping off the paint on the leading edge, I'm just using a stiff brush, adding a little bit of water and letting it sit for a little bit, and then just kind of stabbing it gently. And because this is aka real color paint and it's a lacquer acrylic, it's pretty tough, so it takes a little bit more effort to get that to break. But the nice thing about it taking more effort and being sturdier is the chipping ends up looking a lot nicer and more controlled than with an acrylic paint. For tighter chipping, I switched out the brush for a toothpick and a sewing needle just to get some tiny scratches on the wing. Most P-38s that are in olive drab, especially in the Pacific Theater, show a lot of wear and tear on this side of the aircraft, mostly because that's where the pilot climbs in, and Pacific conditions are pretty rough on aircraft, especially when they're on coral taxiways, runways, and they're getting hit with dust and debris from taking off, landing, and being right on the ocean. I shied away from chipping a little bit after the Spitfire build because I found that aircraft was over-weathered, but I still wanted to push the boundaries a little bit with this P-38, but still have control over what it looked like in the end. Another thing I did as well, which somehow didn't end up in this final cut, was use a high grit sandpaper just to sand down the paint in a few areas as well, just to let those bottom colors show through again, and to go down to the aluminum color. Now normally I do not gloss before decals, however the exception to that rule is Tamiya's decals. Because they're so thick, they take a little bit more work to get them to sit flush with the paint. And the first step with that is after the painting is done, is I lay down 2 layers of wet clear coat and then mist it with MLT just to have a nice sturdy base, because there's going to be a lot of sanding on top of this and I don't want to risk damaging the paint underneath. Once all that's had a chance to dry overnight, I apply the decals and then do 2 coats of clear again. This might not be making sense right this second, but now you can come in with some high grit sandpaper and start to sand down the carrier film on top of the decal. And by taking some time here, taking your time sanding and slowly reducing it, you can seal it all again under a nice semi-clear, and that carrier film is practically gone. I guess the occasional Tamiya decal use makes up for all the gloss coats I'm not using with my other decals. Tamiya does include some masks with this kit, but they're not die cut, so you have to cut them out yourself. So if that's not a route you want to go, Edward has a mask set available as well for the inside and the outside of the canopy. The reference photos I was using for the exhaust superchargers showed a little bit of chipping and rusting in this area, so to replicate that, I laid down some German gray as a base coat for the supercharger, and then came in with some white brush paint on a 000 brush, and just started adding in some chipping, especially in the areas where there'd be welds and joints in the exhaust, because this is where you get some leaking and whatnot. After I'd done that, I added some rust wash and blended that in slightly. I wasn't too worried about how this was going to look, because in the end, I was going to come in and do that fuel staining that the P-38 is famous for, where you really see the brown and tan on the top of the booms. Once the rust wash was on, I just came in with a little bit of graphite powder just to give it a little bit of shine to let you know that this was metal and not painted. If you're going to go this route of installing the superchargers after your tail booms are assembled and don't follow the instructions, you have to cut the locating tab off the bottom in order to push them into place properly. Otherwise they bind and they're going to fight you a little bit. Another challenge I've been trying to take on and do better at is painting leather in aircraft. With the headrests, I would normally just paint it rubber black and be done, but this time around I decided to use some oil paints to try to blend it a bit, and then as it was drying, use another stiffer brush to stipple it to try to give it a leather texture, just to make it a little more interesting. And the best thing with oil paints, especially if you're not happy with it, they're very easy to wipe away and restart, especially on a part like this. And I guess I'm happy with this. It's not great, not terrible, but yeah, it's going to look okay. For doing the exhaust / fuel stainings, all I did was took a half cup of rubbing alcohol, 99%, and put, I think it was 2 drops of Tamiya buff in there. And the nice thing about that being so highly diluted is that shooting it at a high pressure, you just take your time, and it gives you a lot of control of building up that staining, and it really lets you feather it in. And one of the last things to get attached to this model before going into the oils is the Model Master gun barrels. These things are fantastic and I highly recommend them. They're one of these things that are almost as important as seatbelts with a model kit. There's just no way the kit's plastic barrels can come close. Once everything was sealed under 2 coats of flat clear and allowed to dry overnight, it was time to come in with some washes made with Abteilung oil paints. I find they run just as well as the Tamiya panel liner wash, but they remove a lot easier. I've also changed things up a little bit in this video, and instead of including the paints and codes in the video editing itself, I decided to add them in the description block of the video. And that's going to bring this project to a close. I hope you enjoyed it, and Mark, it was fantastic working with you. Again, I really appreciate that you sent another kit out after the MiG disaster, and make sure you guys check out his store. Again, it's HobbyNut Models. It's in the description below, and if you follow that link, you'll get 10% off of any purchase you make. If you'd like to see what's going on behind the scenes, you can join my Patreon page like these fine people have and get some high-def photos, blogs from the bench, and know what the next project is before anyone else. This is the Model Guy. This has been a fun build, and I will see you next time.